Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 313, The Armada. In June of 1587, Dudley left England at the head of another army bound for the Netherlands. The Spanish general, the Duke of Parma, sued for peace since he wanted to play for time. This initiated months of tortured negotiations. On the 29th of July, the Pope signed a treaty with Spain, consenting to Philip to nominate whoever he wanted as the ruler of England, so long as that person was a Catholic. In September, Philip ordered Parma to assemble a fleet of barges for the coming invasion. Aware of the preparations being made, Elizabeth rested her hopes on the outcome of peace talks. She knew that England was in no position to fight a war with Spain. England had no standing army at all and only a very small navy. Meanwhile, such serious differences had arisen between the English and their Dutch allies that it seemed the Netherlands might erupt in a civil war. And in the autumn, Dudley, whose own incompetence was largely to blame, advised the Queen that he could be of no further use there, and so she recalled him in November. Before he left, he ordered a medal to be struck bearing the legend, quote, "I reluctantly leave, not the flock, but the ungrateful ones." Back at court, Dudley found his position diminished. Elizabeth was very disappointed in his performance now twice in the Netherlands. Dudley retired for the moment to the country. He even relinquished the title of Master of Horse, which he had held for almost 30 years, asking the Queen to consider bestowing it upon his stepson, the Earl of Essex. Elizabeth liked the young Earl, though she did recognize he lacked political acumen at this point. There was much to be admired in Essex, though he did have a darker side. He could be moody, imperious, petulant, and difficult. When his temper was aroused, he tended to be impulsive to a fault. He had little sense of self-discipline, and, quote, could conceal nothing. He carries his love and his hatred on his forehead, end quote. He was also rather long to forgive. He was a complex man. He seemed to rush through life at times. He was also a dreamer who seemed to inhabit a world of his own. Sometimes he was unaware even of what food he was eating. He cared little whether his clothes matched at all. He walked with a long stride, his head famously aggressively thrust forward. He was extremely promiscuous, but after casual sex, he would hasten to church to meditate on God and beg forgiveness for several hours. He loved the dazzle of the court, but he also yearned to be at home in the country. Since boyhood, he had been terribly procrastination-prone. Sometimes he would lay in bed for days, hot, shaking, and melancholy, unable to speak or even think rationally. Yet, he was egotistical and driven by ambition. He was desired to be the leader of swordsmen. He wanted to be a warrior. He wanted to be renowned like Henry V before him. He wanted to lead an extravagant lifestyle, and so he needed money. And that was the one thing Essex never had in plenty. He lived beyond his means, existing in a permanent state of near bankruptcy. The Queen, as best as she could, did her best to bail him out. Essex's chief rival at court was Sir Walter Raleigh, at least for the moment, though the latter was usually on the outside looking in. Perhaps that was why he spent so much of his life exploring and sailing the high seas. On the 21st of December, the Queen appointed Charles, Lord Howard of Effingham, Lieutenant General, Lord High Admiral, and Commander of the English Navy, and ordered the fleet be put on standby. There was no doubt now that Philip would send his armada soon. She had known his plans since November. The armada of Spanish galleons was set to defeat the English fleet and paved the way for the Duke of Parma, who would immediately land in England with his army from the Netherlands. When Elizabeth had been deposed and the country secured, Philip would arrive to claim the crown for his daughter and the Catholic faith. The English government was now firmly on a war footing, as we might say today. Defenses were rebuilt and strengthened, especially along the coast. A chain of beacons was set up along the coastline to signal the invasion. Soldiers and sailors alike were recruited to serve. But when it became clear that the Spanish invasion would not be ready until the following summer, Elizabeth demobilized her ships because she couldn't afford to keep them outfitted if they weren't going to be used. Now, to be clear, Elizabeth did not want a war. She'd be prepared if war came, but she had no interest in winning martial glory like her father had been. Her goal had always been peace. The looming reality of war, however, forced Elizabeth to recall Dudley, who urged her to continue to strengthen her defenses. Diplomacy, he bluntly told her, was not going to be an option this time. Sir Francis Drake proposed a daring preemptive strike against Philip's fleet in Spain, but Elizabeth would not allow it. She needed every ship she could get, and the plan was just too risky. She was still holding out hope that it might never come to war. In April, the Queen dispatched Dr. Valentine Dale, her former ambassador to Paris, to Parma to beg for peace. The commissioners for both sides met to discuss the matter on the 30th of May, the very day on which the Spanish Armada of 130 ships, manned by some 30,000 men, under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, set sail from Lisbon, bound for England. By then, the English fleet was already at battle stations at Plymouth. On board, the Spanish ships were thousands of printed copies of the papal bull blessing the enterprise, reaffirming Elizabeth's excommunication and calling upon her subjects to depose her. These were to be distributed in England by the invading force. However, when, late in June, Elizabeth's subjects learned of the existence of the bull, they remained fiercely loyal to their queen. On July 17th, Elizabeth ended the peace negotiations. One way or another, this would be decided at sea. The progress of the Spanish fleet had been held up by a series of storms, but on July 19th, what the Spaniards were calling the quote-unquote invincible Armada was first sighted by the English. According to legend, Sir Francis Drake was gambling at the time the news came in. He declared he had time to finish the game before vanquishing his enemy. As the chain of beacons flared to life, Elizabeth received word of the Armada's approach on the 22nd of July. Cecil often remarked over the next few days how calmly the Queen behaved. Her tranquil demeanor was the result of knowing that everything which could have been done had been done. England, for better or worse, was prepared as it was going to get. Throughout the kingdom, people waited, expectant and fearful. Moving along the south coast, the Armada was making for the Netherlands, where it would escort Parma's army to England. Waiting at Plymouth was the English fleet, 150 strong, and flying the white and green colors of the Tudors from its masts. It was under the command of the Admiral Lord Howard, assisted by the much more experienced Sir Francis Drake. The Admiral, realizing that his rank rather than his naval achievements had qualified him for this command, announced immediately that he would, quote, yield ever unto them of greater experience, end quote. Drake, in turn, behaved lovingly and kindly towards Howard. The Admiral's flagship was the Ark Royal, formerly known as the Ark Raleigh, having been sold to the Queen by Raleigh himself the previous year. Howard had been authorized by the Queen to conduct all engagements according to his own judgment. By contrast, Philip had written detailed and often unrealistic instructions by which the Spanish admiral was to abide. Howard put out to sea in pursuit of the Armada after nightfall on the 19th of July. There was a brief and inconclusive skirmish off Eddystone near Plymouth on Sunday, the 21st, followed by 2 days later of a more vicious engagement near Portland, Dorset, in which several Spanish galleons were severely damaged. 2 more were wrecked off the Isle of Wight on the 25th of July. All the while, the English fleet continued to shadow the Armada as it sailed east. avoiding any further engagements by sailing out of range whenever the galleys turned to prepare for battle. Meanwhile, on land, the levies were mustered. Dudley was in overall command. He had an advanced guard of 4,000 men stationed at the entrance to the Thames, and had built a blockade of boats across so that, come what may, the Spanish would not be able to simply sail straight into the capital. On the 27th of July, the Armada anchored off Calais. There, Parma was waiting with 16,000 troops, 4-1, to cross the Channel. The Dutch fleet was patrolling the sea nearby, hoping to prevent the Spanish from sailing at all. The English followed the Armada to Calais, where at midnight on the 28th, orders were given for 5 quote-unquote hell-burners, fire ships, packed with wood and pitch, to be sent among the galleons. The resulting inferno, flamed by high winds, caused panic and chaos, scattering the Spanish galleons and wrecking the crescent formation of the Armada, which was unable to regroup because of the winds. This meant that the little English ships would now be able to fight on more equal terms. As a result of this action, morale against the Spanish forces was fatally weakened. On the 29th of July, off Gravelines, the Spanish admiral made heroic, not entirely unsuccessful efforts to reform his ships before the two fleets engaged in what would be the final battle. But the English, with greater numbers, now had the advantage, and they pressed it home. The Spaniards lost 11 ships and 2,000 men, and the English just 50 men. The action was only abandoned when both sides ran out of ammunition. Elizabeth, however, did not yet know about the victory, so on July 30th, she moved to the more defensible St. James Palace. And it was then that the wind changed direction, driving the remaining Spanish galleons north and destroying many. The wind, what people were already calling the quote-unquote Protestant Wind, was responsible for most of the overall Spanish losses. On August the 2nd, Lord Howard called off the English pursuit. By this time, most of the Spanish ships remaining were wandering the Scottish waters. One English sailor wrote, quote, "Many of them will never see Spain again." Although false reports of victory had prompted premature rejoicing in Spain, by the 3rd of August, when the Spanish admiral ordered his remaining few ships to return home, it was clear that the Spanish had suffered the most humiliating naval defeat in their history. They had lost 2/3 of their men, many dying stranded on remote beaches of wounds and sickness, or slaughtered in Ireland by the Lord Deputy's men, and 44 ships and many more were so badly damaged that they would no longer be seaworthy. The English, on the other hand, had lost only 100 men and none of their ships. Elizabeth was cautious. This, quote, "tyrannical, proud, and brain-sick attempt," end quote, would be, she observed in a letter to James VI, the beginning, though not the end, of the ruin of that King Philip. Contrary to how the defeat of the Spanish Armada is typically portrayed, it wasn't all over. Parma was still just across the channel with 16,000 troops. He still had the necessary transports. All he needed was a favorable wind. Elizabeth herself, against the wishes of her council, rode out to encourage her troops on the 8th of August. Riding a white gelding and dressed, quote, "like a bright angel," end quote, she looked like a queen triumphant. Hundreds fell to their knees, calling out, "Lord, preserve our queen," as she passed. The following morning, she addressed her troops again, delivering the most famous speech of her reign. "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed of how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I do assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguards in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of battle to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and my kingdom, and for my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And think it foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I will myself take up arms. I myself will be your general judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues. In the meantime, my Lieutenant General Dudley shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject. Not doubting, but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp and valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over these enemies of God, of my kingdom, and of my people. By noon, though, word had reached the English that there would be no invasion. Parma, without the support of the Spanish navy, would not advance. Philip, with a heavy heart, had ultimately agreed. The enterprise of England had failed. On August the 10th, Elizabeth returned to a triumphant London. Thanks to the thorough preparations made by the government, the intensive training and organization of troops and resources, the skill of the English commanders, and of course, the Protestant Wind, the mighty Armada had been vanquished, and England had achieved one of the greatest victories in all of its history. Most of the men were dismissed on or about August the 17th. England lost few men in the actual fighting, but the ships had been so badly provisioned that many sailors now lay sick or even dying in ports up and down the coast, suffering from scurvy and typhoid. Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake paid out of their own pockets for supplies to alleviate their suffering. On August the 26th, the official victory celebration went forward at Whitehall. Then, on September the 4th, tragedy struck. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, sick for some time, died at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sadly, for a man so utterly committed to his queen, he continued to be slandered by his enemies long after his death. The poet Spenser wrote dismissively of Dudley, "He is now dead, and all his glories gone, and all his greatness vapored to naught. His name is worn already out of thought. Nay, any poet seeks him to revive, yet many poets honored him alive." Elizabeth was grief-stricken. Dudley had been closer to anyone, to her perhaps, maybe Cecil. She had often called Dudley her brother and best friend. It was also to Elizabeth a sign that her own end could not be long in the coming. Her and Dudley had grown up together as she had become queen and grew into the role. Now he was gone. Dudley's death went virtually unnoticed, and certainly unmourned in the national elation that followed the defeat of the Armada. Elizabeth had to put on a brave face in order to lead the people in their celebrations, but it was noticed that autumn that she was, quote, much aged and spent, and very melancholy, unquote. When she sat for George Gower for the famous Armada portrait that's in a lot of textbooks today, she wore Dudley's pearls, as she would in many subsequent portraits. All of November was consumed by festivities and celebrations, culminating in a massive feast of Thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral on November 22nd. There, the English victory was declared to have been the greatest since Agincourt. Elizabeth's reputation was never greater than at this time, making her the most respected monarch in Christendom. Even her enemies acknowledged her qualities. The Pope declared, quote, "She certainly is a great queen, and were she only a Catholic, she would be our dearly beloved daughter. Just look how well she governs. She is only a woman, only a mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, by all," end quote. He jested, this is the Pope again, that he wished he was free to marry her, writing, quote, "What a wife she would make, what children she would have. They would have ruled the whole world," end quote. He also praised Sir Francis Drake, by the way, who was very much involved in the victory. It was a time for superlatives, honestly. In France and Italy, as in Rome, Catholics honored the Queen. Henri III, lauded her valor, spirit, and prudence, declaring that her victory, quote, would compare with the greatest feats of the most illustrious men of past times, end quote. Even the Ottoman Sultan wrote, singing her praises, and actually agreed to a peace treaty with Poland for her sake. After 1588 and the famous Armada, the fame of the Virgin Queen spread far and wide, while in England, where her people basked in the reflective glow of her victory, her legend grew, giving rise to a new cult figure, Eliza Triumphant. She was more convinced now than ever that God had destined her to rule her people, and that the victory was a signal manifestation of the divine will. For the rest of her reign, writers and artists would portray her, all the elements bowing to her authority. Her Catholic subjects, in the end, had proven themselves loyal, and the threat of insurrection had now receded. This worked out for her Catholic subjects too, by the way, because it paved the way for more tolerance in the future. The conviction of the Protestant majority that God in providence had intervened in God's hour of need gave a new stability to the Anglican Church. Above all, there was a surge of national confidence, which led to the flowering of literature and decorative arts, which would become known in later years as the English Renaissance. At Westminster, a schoolboy named John Sly admirably expressed the mood of the English people in the text of his Julius Caesar's works, which is actually preserved at Oxford. You can go see it. He repeatedly scribbled the Queen's name, along with this couplet. The rose is red, the leaves are green. God save Elizabeth, our noble queen. Next week, we leave England for a moment and roll back to France, where despite everyone's best efforts, the line of Valois, having ruled France since the 13th century, comes to an end.